The rain hammered against the windows of St. Mary's Hospital as Sarah Chen finished her rounds in the emergency department. After 15 years as a registered nurse, she had seen everything the night shift could throw at her, but tonight felt different. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. when the automatic doors burst open with a violent whoosh. Two men stumbled through the entrance, one supporting the other who was barely conscious. The injured man's shirt was soaked with blood, and his face was pale as moonlight. Sarah immediately recognized the signs of severe blood loss and internal trauma. She had seen similar wounds during her previous life as a CIA field medic, before she traded covert operations for the quieter world of civilian healthcare. "Help us," shouted the man providing support. His expensive suit was now stained with his companion's blood. "He's been shot multiple times. We were ambushed outside the embassy." Sarah's training kicked in instantly. She called for a gurney while quickly assessing the wounded man's condition. His breathing was shallow and rapid, classic signs of shock. Multiple gunshot wounds were visible across his torso, and she could tell from the entry patterns that at least one bullet had likely pierced vital organs. Dr. Marcus Webb, the attending physician, arrived within minutes. A skilled surgeon with 20 years of experience, he took one look at the patient and shook his head grimly. The wounded man's identification revealed his name as Agent David Morrison, a federal operative whose credentials suggested high-level security clearance. "Get him to Trauma Bay 3 immediately," Dr. Webb ordered, his voice tense. The medical team worked swiftly, transferring Morrison onto the examination table. Sarah connected monitoring equipment while other nurses established 4 lines and began administering emergency medications. The electronic monitors painted a terrifying picture. Morrison's blood pressure was dropping rapidly, his heart rate was dangerously irregular, and his oxygen saturation levels were critically low. Dr. Webb examined the wounds with growing concern, his experienced hands probing carefully around the damaged tissue. "The internal bleeding is massive," he announced to the team. 2 bullets appear to have damaged major vessels near the heart. One has likely punctured the liver, and there's possible damage to the lung cavity. He paused, checking Morrison's pupil response with a flashlight. His neurological responses are also deteriorating. Sarah watched the monitors with growing alarm. In her CIA days, she had saved lives under impossible conditions in war zones across 3 continents. She had performed emergency surgery in bombed-out buildings, treated chemical weapon exposure in desert compounds, and kept fellow operatives alive during extraction missions that lasted days. Her unconventional medical training had been forged in the fires of real-world crisis situations where textbook procedures often proved inadequate. Dr. Webb ordered immediate surgery, but, as the team prepared Morrison for the operating room, his condition continued to deteriorate. The blood loss was accelerating, and his vital signs were becoming increasingly unstable. Standard protocol called for massive transfusion therapy and immediate surgical intervention, but Sarah could see something others were missing. During her CIA service, she had encountered a similar case in Afghanistan. A fellow operative had sustained comparable injuries during a Taliban ambush, and conventional medical wisdom had declared the situation hopeless. However, Sarah had discovered that certain battlefield trauma techniques, while unconventional, could sometimes achieve results that traditional emergency medicine could not. Sarah approached Dr. Webb as he scrubbed for surgery. "His injury pattern suggests we might need to consider alternative approaches. In my experience with similar trauma cases, standard surgical protocol might not be sufficient." Dr. Webb looked at her with surprise. "Nurse Chen, I appreciate your input, but this requires immediate conventional surgical intervention. We need to locate the bleeding sources and repair the damage using established procedures." Sarah understood his perspective. Dr. Webb was an excellent surgeon who had saved countless lives using proven medical techniques. However, she also knew that Morrison's injuries were beyond what conventional surgery could address in time. The combination of multiple penetrating trauma, massive blood loss, and the specific positioning of the wounds created a scenario she had encountered before in her covert operations. As Morrison was wheeled toward the operating room, his companion from earlier approached Sarah. His name was Thomas Burke, and he identified himself as Morrison's handler within a classified government agency. Burke's eyes were filled with desperation as he grabbed Sarah's arm.
Listen, Burke whispered urgently. David Morrison isn't just any federal agent.
He's carrying information that could prevent a terrorist attack planned for tomorrow morning. 3 major cities are at risk, and he's the only person who knows the specific targets and timing.
If he dies, thousands of innocent people could be killed.
The weight of this revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked back toward the trauma bay where Morrison's life was slipping away minute by minute. Dr. Webb and his team were preparing for surgery, but Sarah could see from the monitors that Morrison might not survive the procedure in his current condition. Burke continued, his voice barely audible above the hospital noise. The people who shot him are still out there. They know he's here, and they'll try to finish the job if they get the chance. But, more importantly, David has memorized details about a coordinated attack that will happen at dawn.
We have less than 4 hours to save his life and get that information. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities.
In the CIA, she had developed expertise in trauma medicine that went far beyond standard nursing protocols. She had learned techniques from military medics, foreign operatives, and even battlefield doctors in conflict zones where conventional medical supplies were unavailable. Some of these methods were considered too risky for civilian medicine, but they had proven effective in desperate situations. Dr. Webb emerged from the scrub room, fully prepared for surgery.
His expression was grim as he approached Sarah and Burke.
I have to be honest with you, he said quietly. Mr. Morrison's chances are extremely poor. The internal damage is extensive, and he's lost too much blood. We'll do everything we can, but you should prepare for the worst possible outcome. Sarah felt a familiar surge of determination, the same feeling she had experienced countless times during her covert operations. She had never accepted impossible as a final answer, especially when lives hung in the balance. Looking at Burke, then at Dr. Webb, she made a decision that would change everything. Dr. Webb, she said firmly. I need to speak with you privately about Mr. Morrison's case.
There are medical techniques I learned during my previous service that might be applicable here.
Unconventional approaches that could potentially save his life when standard procedures aren't sufficient. Dr. Webb studied her carefully. He had worked with Sarah for 3 years and knew her to be an exceptional nurse with an unusual depth of medical knowledge. However, he had never heard her speak with such authority about advanced trauma treatment.
What kind of previous service? He asked, curiosity evident in his voice.
Sarah glanced around the busy emergency department, then met his gaze directly. I spent 12 years as a field medic with the Central Intelligence Agency.
I've treated trauma cases in conditions that would be considered impossible for conventional medicine.
I've saved lives using techniques that aren't taught in medical school but have proven effective in extreme situations.
The revelation stunned Dr. Webb into silence.
He looked at Sarah with new eyes, trying to reconcile the quiet, efficient nurse he knew with the image of a CIA operative performing emergency medicine in dangerous foreign locations.
Burke stepped forward, producing credentials that confirmed Sarah's background. Dr. Webb, Sarah Chen was one of the most decorated field medics in CIA history.
She saved lives in situations that would have killed patients in the best hospitals. If she says she can help David Morrison, I believe we should listen to her. Morrison's condition continued to worsen as the conversation unfolded. The monitors showed his blood pressure dropping to critical levels, and his heart rhythm was becoming increasingly irregular. Time was running out rapidly, and conventional surgery was looking less viable with each passing minute.
Dr. Webb faced an impossible decision.
His medical training told him to proceed with standard surgical protocol, but Sarah's background and the urgency of the situation suggested that unconventional approaches might be Morrison's only hope. The ethical implications were staggering, but the potential consequences of inaction were even worse. Sarah could see the conflict in Dr. Webb's eyes. She understood his position perfectly. As a hospital physician, he was bound by strict protocols and liability concerns that didn't exist in the field operations where she had learned her most effective techniques. However, she also knew that Morrison would die without immediate intervention that went beyond conventional medical practice. Doctor, Sarah said quietly, in 4 hours, thousands of people might die if we can't save Agent Morrison.
I'm not asking you to violate your medical ethics.
I'm asking you to trust my experience and let me try approaches that might work when standard procedures won't be enough.
The emergency department around them continued its relentless pace.
Other patients arrived with their own urgent needs, and the medical staff worked efficiently to address each crisis. But, in Trauma Bay 3, Agent Morrison's life hung by an increasingly thin thread, and the clock was ticking toward a potential catastrophe that only he could prevent. Dr. Webb looked at the monitors showing Morrison's deteriorating condition, then, at Sarah's determined expression. The decision he made in the next few moments would determine not only Morrison's fate but, potentially, the lives of thousands of innocent people who had no idea their safety depended on what happened in this hospital room. The stage was set for a medical intervention unlike anything St. Mary's Hospital had ever witnessed, combining conventional surgical expertise with covert field medicine in a desperate race against time and death itself. Dr. Webb stared at the monitors displaying Agent Morrison's rapidly declining vital signs. His medical instincts screamed that they needed to get the patient into surgery immediately, but Sarah's revelation about her CIA background had planted seeds of doubt about conventional approaches. Morrison's blood pressure had dropped to 70/40, dangerously low even for emergency surgery.
What exactly are you proposing? Dr.
Webb asked Sarah, his voice tight with the pressure of the situation. Sarah moved closer to Morrison's bedside, her trained eyes taking in details that others might miss. In the field, we learned that certain types of penetrating trauma create unique challenges that standard emergency protocols don't address effectively. Based on the wound patterns and his vital signs, I believe Morrison has what we called cascade bleeding, multiple damaged vessels that are feeding into each other, creating a bleeding pattern that surgical intervention alone can't stop quickly enough. Burke watched anxiously as Sarah explained her assessment.
During a mission in Syria, I encountered a similar case.
The operative had been shot multiple times in a pattern almost identical to Morrison's injuries. The field surgeon tried conventional approaches, but the patient was bleeding out faster than we could repair the damage. That's when I learned about a technique that's not taught in civilian medicine.
Dr. Webb frowned. What kind of technique?
Strategic hypothermia combined with targeted pressure application, Sarah replied. It's based on the principle that if you can slow the body's metabolic processes while applying precise pressure to specific points, you can sometimes buy enough time to address the most critical injuries first. It's risky, but, in cases like this, it can be the difference between life and death. The concept made Dr. Webb uncomfortable. Induced hypothermia was used in certain cardiac procedures, but applying it in this situation went against standard trauma protocols.
The risks of complications could be enormous.
Cardiac arrest, brain damage, organ failure, the list goes on.
Sarah nodded gravely. I understand the risks, doctor.
But, look at his current trajectory. His blood pressure is continuing to drop, his heart rate is becoming more irregular, and his oxygen saturation is barely staying above critical levels. Conventional surgery in his current state has maybe a 10% chance of success.
The technique I'm describing could improve those odds significantly. Morrison's monitor suddenly began alarming more urgently.
His heart rhythm had shifted into a dangerous pattern that indicated his cardiovascular system was beginning to fail. The trauma team rushed to administer emergency medications, but Sarah could see that they were fighting a losing battle against the massive blood loss.
We're running out of time, Burke said desperately.
If David dies, we have no way to identify the terrorist targets. The attack is scheduled for 6:30 a.m., and it's already past 3:15. Even if we save him, he needs to be conscious enough to provide the critical intelligence. Dr. Webb made a decision that went against everything his conventional medical training had taught him. Explain the procedure to me step by step.
If I'm going to allow this, I need to understand exactly what you're proposing to do.
Sarah began describing the technique with the precision of someone who had performed it multiple times under extreme conditions. First, we need to lower his core body temperature to approximately 89 degrees Fahrenheit. This slows his metabolism and reduces the oxygen demand of his organs, buying us time to work. Simultaneously, we apply targeted pressure to specific arterial points that correspond to the bleeding sources.
She moved to Morrison's bedside and indicated precise locations on his torso.
These pressure points aren't in standard medical textbooks because they were developed through battlefield experience. By applying pressure here, here, and here, we can reduce blood flow to the damaged areas while maintaining circulation to vital organs. Dr. Webb studied the pressure points Sarah was indicating. They were located at intersections of major blood vessels that weren't typically addressed in standard trauma procedures.
How do you know these will work?
Because I've used them successfully in situations where conventional medicine failed, Sarah replied.
During my CIA service, I saved 17 operatives using variations of this technique.
It's not perfect, and it requires constant monitoring, but it can stabilize patients long enough to perform more precise surgical interventions. The conversation was interrupted by another alarm from Morrison's monitors. His blood pressure had dropped to a barely detectable level, and his consciousness was fading rapidly. Dr. Webb realized they had reached the point where conventional approaches were no longer viable.
"What do you need from me and the medical team?" he asked Sarah.
Sarah felt a surge of relief that Dr. Webb was willing to trust her expertise. "I need you to prepare for surgery, but modified surgery. Instead of trying to repair all the damage immediately, we'll focus on the most critical bleeding source while maintaining the hypothermia and pressure points. It's like performing surgery on a patient who's in controlled suspended animation." The next 20 minutes became a carefully choreographed dance between conventional medicine and covert field techniques. Sarah directed the team in applying the strategic cooling while she positioned her hands on the critical pressure points. The effect was almost immediate. Morrison's blood pressure stabilized at a low but sustainable level. Dr. Webb watched in amazement as Morrison's vital signs, while still critical, stopped their precipitous decline.
"This is incredible.
His bleeding rate has slowed dramatically." Sarah maintained her position, applying precise pressure while monitoring Morrison's responses. The hypothermia is reducing his body's demand for oxygen and nutrients, while the pressure points are controlling the major bleeding sources.
"But we only have a limited window."
His body can't sustain this state for more than 45 minutes without risking permanent damage.
Burke paced anxiously nearby, checking his watch repeatedly. "It's 3:47 a.m. Even if we save him, will he be conscious enough to provide the intelligence we need?"
"That's the next challenge," Sarah admitted. "Bringing him back to consciousness safely while maintaining enough stability to keep him alive.
It requires a very careful balance of medications and gradual warming."
Dr. Webb began the surgical procedure under these unprecedented conditions. With Morrison's bleeding controlled by Sarah's pressure technique, he could work more precisely to identify and repair the most critical damage. The combination of conventional surgical skill and unconventional stabilization methods created possibilities that neither approach could achieve alone. 20 minutes into the procedure, Dr. Webb successfully located and repaired the most serious arterial damage. "The major bleeding source is controlled," he announced. "But he still has significant injuries that need attention." Sarah carefully adjusted her pressure points as Dr. Webb worked. "We can address those systematically now that the immediate threat to his life is controlled. The key is maintaining the balance between stabilization and gradual recovery." As Dr. Webb continued his work, he found himself developing a new respect for the unconventional medical techniques Sarah had learned during her covert service. The combination of field medicine and hospital resources was proving more effective than either approach could accomplish independently.
Morrison's monitors began showing signs of improvement.
His heart rhythm became more regular, and his blood pressure started rising towards safer levels. The surgical repairs were holding, and the controlled hypothermia was preventing the cascade of complications that had threatened his life. "His condition is stabilizing," Dr. Webb reported with cautious optimism. "The question now is whether we can bring him back to consciousness without triggering another crisis." Sarah had been monitoring Morrison's neurological responses throughout the procedure. His brain activity has remained stable despite the trauma. "I believe we can begin the warming process, but it needs to be gradual and carefully monitored." Burke approached the surgical table.
"How long before he might be conscious enough to communicate?"
Under normal circumstances, it could take hours, Sarah replied. But, there are techniques we can use to accelerate his recovery while maintaining his stability. Again, these are methods I learned in the field where time was always critical. Dr. Webb looked at Sarah with newfound admiration. What you've accomplished here goes beyond anything I learned in medical school. This patient should have died, but your techniques have given us a real chance to save him. Sarah began the delicate process of gradually raising Morrison's body temperature while adjusting the pressure points to maintain circulation. The next 30 minutes will be critical. We need to bring him back to normal function without shocking his system into another crisis. Morrison's vital signs continued to improve as Sarah skillfully managed his recovery. His blood pressure stabilized in a safer range, his heart rhythm became more regular, and his oxygen saturation levels improved steadily. The surgical repairs held firm as his cardiovascular system gradually returned to normal function. At 4:23 a.m., Morrison's eyes began to flutter open. Sarah immediately assessed his neurological responses while Dr. Webb monitored his vital signs. The combination of surgical expertise and unconventional field medicine had achieved what seemed impossible less than 2 hours earlier. Burke leaned over Morrison's bedside. "David, can you hear me? We need to know about the attack plan for this morning." Morrison's voice was weak but clear. "The targets. I remember the targets." His eyes focused on Burke with growing awareness. 3 cities. Coordinated strikes. I have the details. Sarah felt a wave of relief and satisfaction. The techniques she had learned in the shadows of covert operations had saved not only Morrison's life but potentially thousands of innocent lives. The unconventional approach had succeeded where conventional medicine would have failed. Dr. Webb shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like this. The combination of your field techniques with surgical intervention created possibilities I never imagined." However, their success was about to face an unexpected challenge. Through the hospital windows, Sarah noticed suspicious movement in the parking area. Dark vehicles had arrived, and figures were moving purposefully toward the hospital entrance. The people who had tried to kill Morrison were apparently not finished with their mission. Sarah's trained eyes immediately recognized the tactical movement patterns of the figures approaching the hospital. After 12 years in the CIA, she could identify hostile operatives from their body language and coordination alone. The way they moved in formation, checked corners, and communicated through subtle hand signals marked them as professional killers. "Burke," she whispered urgently, "we have company. At least 6 hostiles approaching from the parking area. They're armed and moving with military precision." Burke's face went pale as he looked toward the windows. "They've found us. David's information is too valuable for them to let him live." He quickly pulled out his phone to call for backup, but Sarah stopped him. "Phone calls won't help us in the next 10 minutes, she said firmly. "We need to secure Morrison and prepare for immediate threat response. These people won't hesitate to kill everyone in this hospital to eliminate their target." Dr. Webb looked confused and frightened. "What are you talking about? This is a hospital. They can't just walk in here and start shooting people." Sarah's expression was grim. "Doctor, these are the same people who ambushed a federal agent outside an embassy. They've already committed multiple felonies tonight, and they won't stop now. Morrison has information that could expose a major terrorist operation. They'll do whatever it takes to silence him permanently." Morrison, despite his weakened condition, was alert enough to understand the danger. "Sarah's right," he said weakly. "These aren't ordinary criminals. They're part of a sophisticated network that's been planning this attack for months. They have resources and training that make them extremely dangerous." Burke checked his weapon and surveyed the emergency department. "The hospital security won't be equipped to handle this kind of threat. We need to find a way to protect David while getting the critical intelligence to my agency." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The emergency department was a maze of rooms, corridors, and medical equipment that could provide both advantages and disadvantages in a hostile situation. Her CIA training had included extensive preparation for exactly this type of scenario, protecting valuable assets under enemy fire.
We need to move Morrison to a more defensible position, she decided. Trauma Bay 3 is too exposed.
There's a secure storage area near the pharmacy that has limited access points and communication equipment. Dr. Webb protested immediately.
You can't move him. He just came out of major surgery.
The stress could kill him. The stress of being shot by assassins will definitely kill him, Sarah replied. We can maintain his medical stability during movement if we're careful.
I've evacuated wounded operatives under fire before.
Through the windows, they could see the hostile operatives had reached the hospital entrance. They moved with calculated purpose, some heading for the main entrance while others circled toward service entrances and emergency exits. Their coordination suggested they had reconnaissance intelligence about the hospital's layout.
Sarah quickly assessed their options. Burke, how many rounds do you have?
18 in the clip, plus 2 spare magazines, he replied.
That won't be enough if they have the numbers I think they do, Sarah said grimly. We need to think strategically about this. My CIA training included defensive tactics for protecting assets in hostile environments.
Morrison struggled to sit up despite his injuries.
Sarah, there's something you need to know. The terrorist attack isn't just about the 3 cities.
It's part of a larger operation designed to trigger a specific government response. If they succeed in killing me and preventing the intelligence from reaching my agency, the consequences will go far beyond the immediate casualties. The gravity of the situation became even more intense. Sarah realized they weren't just fighting to save Morrison's life, they were potentially preventing a cascade of events that could affect national security for years to come.
What kind of government response? Burke asked urgently.
Morrison's voice was strained but clear. The attacks are designed to force the implementation of emergency security measures that will give certain people unprecedented access to critical infrastructure systems.
It's not just terrorism, it's a sophisticated plan to gain control of key government and corporate networks. Dr. Webb listened to this conversation with growing alarm. This sounds like something from a movie. Are you telling me that our hospital is now in the middle of some kind of international conspiracy?
I'm telling you that we have about 5 minutes before armed killers walk through those doors, Sarah said bluntly. We can discuss the political implications later if we survive long enough. Sarah began preparing Morrison for emergency transport while maintaining the medical interventions that were keeping him stable. Dr. Webb, I need you to gather essential medical supplies that we can take with us. Morrison's condition is stable but still critical. He'll need continued monitoring and possible intervention.
Burke positioned himself near the entrance to the emergency department, watching for signs of the approaching threat.
They're taking their time, probably surveying the area and identifying escape routes.
Professional work.
Sarah's mind shifted into the tactical mode she had developed during countless dangerous missions. The pharmacy storage area I mentioned has reinforced walls, limited access points, and communication equipment that can reach federal agencies directly. If we can get Morrison there safely, we can hold a defensive position while transmitting the critical intelligence. Dr. Webb gathered medical supplies with shaking hands.
I've never been in a situation like this. What happens if they get past us?
They won't, Sarah said with the confidence of someone who had survived impossible situations before. I didn't spend 12 years learning unconventional combat medicine just to let hospital administrators get killed by foreign operatives. The first sign of trouble came when the hospital's main lights suddenly dimmed. The hostile operatives had apparently found a way to interfere with the building's electrical systems, creating confusion and reducing visibility.
Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie shadows throughout the emergency department. They're moving, Burke announced tensely.
I can see figures approaching the main entrance.
Sarah finished preparing Morrison for transport.
Despite his injuries, she had managed to stabilize him enough that careful movement wouldn't immediately threaten his life. Dr. Webb, stay close to me and follow my instructions exactly.
Burke, you take point.
We move fast but carefully.
Morrison looked at Sarah with gratitude and determination.
Sarah, before we move, you need to know the specific details about tomorrow's attack.
In case something happens to me, the information needs to reach my agency. Sarah listened intently as Morrison rapidly outlined the key intelligence about the planned terrorist attacks.
3 major cities, specific timing, targeted infrastructure, and the names of key conspirators. The information was complex and detailed, requiring her to memorize critical facts that could save thousands of lives.
Got it, she said after Morrison finished his briefing. Now let's make sure you live long enough to provide the complete details to the proper authorities. They began moving through the hospital corridors toward the pharmacy storage area.
Sarah pushed Morrison's gurney while monitoring his vital signs. Dr. Webb carried essential medical supplies, and Burke provided security. The emergency lighting created a surreal atmosphere as they navigated the maze of hospital corridors. Halfway to their destination, they heard the first sounds of forced entry. The hostile operatives had breached the main entrance and were beginning their systematic search of the emergency department. Voices echoed through the corridors, speaking in a language Sarah recognized as Eastern European.
Russian or Ukrainian, she whispered to Burke.
Professional military background, probably former Spetsnaz or similar special forces.
Burke's expression grew more grim. That explains their tactical sophistication. These aren't ordinary criminals, they're trained military operators working for someone with serious resources. Sarah's CIA experience had included encounters with former Soviet Special Forces operatives who had transitioned to private military work.
They were extremely dangerous adversaries who combined military training with complete ruthlessness. The situation had just become significantly more challenging. They reached the pharmacy storage area without detection, but Sarah could hear the search teams getting closer. The room was small but defensible, with thick walls and only one entrance. Communication equipment allowed direct contact with federal agencies, and medical supplies would keep Morrison stable during a potential siege.
Burke, contact your agency immediately, Sarah ordered.
Tell them we have the intelligence about the terrorist attacks, but we're under hostile fire at St. Mary's Hospital.
We need immediate tactical support.
Dr. Webb set up medical monitoring equipment while Sarah assessed their defensive position. The pharmacy storage area was better than the open emergency department, but it could become a trap if the hostile operatives found them. Morrison's condition remained stable despite the stress of movement and the dangerous situation.
Sarah's field medical techniques continued to prove effective even under extreme circumstances. However, she knew that prolonged stress could trigger complications that would require immediate intervention.
The terrorists planned to hit Grand Central Station in New York, Union Station in Washington, D.C., and LAX Airport in Los Angeles, Morrison said urgently to Burke. The attacks are scheduled for 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, coordinated to maximum psychological impact and casualty numbers. Burke transmitted this information while Sarah prepared defensive positions using hospital equipment and supplies. Her CIA training had included improvised fortification techniques that could be applied even in civilian environments like hospitals. The sound of approaching footsteps indicated that their hiding place had been discovered. The hostile operatives were moving systematically through the hospital, and they had apparently identified the pharmacy area as a likely refuge.
Sarah could hear multiple sets of boots moving with tactical precision toward their location.
"They've found us," she announced quietly.
"Everyone stay calm and follow my lead. We're about to find out if hospital medicine and covert operations training can work together under enemy fire."
The door handle began to turn slowly, indicating that their pursuers were preparing to breach their position. Sarah positioned herself between the door and Morrison's gurney, ready to apply every technique she had learned during 12 years of dangerous CIA operations.
The next few minutes would determine whether Morrison's critical intelligence would reach the authorities in time to prevent a devastating terrorist attack.
The door handle stopped turning, and Sarah realized the hostile operatives were preparing for a coordinated breach. In the tense silence, she could hear whispered communications in Russian just outside the pharmacy storage room. Her CIA training had prepared her for exactly this scenario, but protecting civilians while defending a critically injured patient added layers of complexity she had never faced before. Sarah quickly assessed their resources. Burke had his service weapon with limited ammunition, Dr. Webb had medical supplies but no combat experience, and Morrison was stable but helpless. The pharmacy storage area contained various medical equipment that could potentially be used defensively, but nothing specifically designed for combat situations. "Burke," Sarah whispered, "when they breach that door, they'll expect to find us huddled defensively. Instead, we're going to take the initiative. I learned in Syria that the best defense in confined spaces is aggressive counteraction." Burke nodded, checking his weapon one final time. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah had noticed that the pharmacy storage area connected to an adjacent supply room through a service corridor. "There's a secondary access point through that supply room. When they breach the main door, you circle around and hit them from the side. I'll create a distraction from the front." Dr. Webb looked terrified but determined. "What about Morrison? We can't leave him unprotected." "Morrison stays right here with you," Sarah replied. "Your job is to keep him medically stable no matter what happens around you. Continue monitoring his vital signs and be ready to perform emergency interventions if needed." Morrison, despite his injuries, was alert enough to understand the tactical situation. "Sarah, there's something else you should know. The terrorists have a fail-safe plan. If they can't kill me before I transmit the intelligence, they have a backup operation that will trigger the attacks early." This revelation changed everything. Sarah realized they weren't just fighting to save Morrison's life, they were racing against a deadline that could move up at any moment. How early could they trigger the attacks? "If they confirm that I've transmitted the intelligence to federal agencies, they could move the timeline up to as early as 5 a.m., Morrison replied weakly. "It's currently 4:31 a.m. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility intensify. They had less than 30 minutes to eliminate the immediate threat, ensure Morrison's survival, and confirm that the intelligence had reached the proper authorities. The margin for error had essentially disappeared. The door suddenly exploded inward as the hostile operatives used a breaching charge to gain entry. Sarah had anticipated this and positioned herself behind a reinforced medical cabinet that provided cover from the initial assault. The explosion created confusion and smoke that she could use to her advantage. 3 operatives entered the room with military precision, using tactical formation and coordinated movement. Sarah recognized their equipment and techniques as professional-grade military assault tactics. These were not ordinary criminals but trained special forces operatives with extensive combat experience. Sarah immediately implemented the counterattack strategy she had outlined to Burke. Using medical equipment as improvised weapons and cover, she engaged the first operative who entered the room. Her CIA hand-to-hand combat training proved effective even in the confined space of the pharmacy storage area. Burke executed the flanking maneuver perfectly, entering through the supply room corridor just as the operatives focused on Sarah's frontal attack. His tactical position allowed him to neutralize the second operative before the enemy team could adjust to the two-front assault. The third operative proved more challenging. He had anticipated the possibility of coordinated defense and positioned himself to cover both potential attack angles. Sarah found herself in a direct confrontation with a highly trained adversary while trying to protect Morrison and Dr. Webb. Dr. Webb, despite the chaos around him, continued monitoring Morrison's medical condition. The stress of the combat situation was affecting Morrison's vital signs, and Dr. Webb had to administer emergency medications to prevent a cardiac crisis triggered by the adrenaline and noise. Sarah's combat with the third operative became a test of her CIA training against professional military experience. The confined space of the storage room created unique challenges, with medical equipment and supplies becoming both obstacles and potential weapons. Her unconventional training gave her advantages that the operative hadn't anticipated. After an intense struggle that lasted several minutes, Sarah managed to neutralize the third operative using a combination of hand-to-hand techniques and improvised medical equipment. The immediate threat was eliminated, but she knew that more operatives were likely searching the hospital. Burke immediately contacted his agency to report their status and confirm transmission of Morrison's intelligence. "This is Agent Burke. We have successfully defended the asset and transmitted critical intelligence about planned terrorist attacks.
Request immediate tactical support at St. Mary's Hospital. Sarah checked Morrison's condition after the combat engagement. Despite the stress, Dr. Webb's medical interventions had kept him stable throughout the confrontation. However, she could see that Morrison was approaching the limits of what his injured body could endure. "We need to get out of this hospital," Sarah decided. "There are probably more operatives, and Morrison needs proper surgical facilities to complete his recovery. Plus, we need to ensure the intelligence reaches multiple agencies to prevent any communication failures." Dr. Webb had proven himself during the crisis, maintaining professional medical care even under enemy fire. Morrison's condition is stable but still critical. He can survive transport, but he'll need continued monitoring and possible intervention. Burke received confirmation from his agency that tactical support teams were en route, but they wouldn't arrive for another 15 minutes. "We need to hold this position or find a better defensive location until backup arrives." Sarah's tactical assessment suggested that staying in one location made them vulnerable to coordinated assault from remaining operatives. "We moved to the hospital's communications center. It has better defensive positions and multiple escape routes if needed." They began another careful movement through the hospital corridors, with Sarah providing security, Burke coordinating with federal agencies, and Dr. Webb maintaining Morrison's medical stability. The hospital had become strangely quiet, suggesting that either the remaining operatives had withdrawn or were planning a more sophisticated attack. Morrison remained conscious enough to provide additional details about the terrorist network. "Sarah, the people behind this operation have connections throughout multiple government agencies. The intelligence needs to reach specific individuals who can be trusted to act on it without compromise." This revelation added another layer of complexity to their situation. Sarah realized that successfully transmitting the intelligence was only the first step. Ensuring it reached trustworthy officials who could prevent the attacks required careful coordination with multiple federal agencies. They reached the hospital's communications center without encountering additional hostiles. The facility provided secure communication links to various federal agencies and had defensive advantages that made it easier to protect Morrison while coordinating the intelligence transmission. Burke established contact with senior officials at the CIA, FBI, and Homeland Security, ensuring that Morrison's intelligence about the terrorist attacks reached multiple independent channels. The redundancy would prevent any single point of failure from compromising the operation. At 5:02 a.m., they received confirmation that federal agencies had begun implementing counter-terrorism responses based on Morrison's intelligence. Tactical teams were being deployed to the 3 target cities, and the specific terrorist cells he had identified were being tracked and intercepted. Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment as she realized their combined efforts had succeeded. Morrison's life had been saved using unconventional medical techniques, they had fought off professional assassins using improvised tactics, and the intelligence about the terrorist attacks had reached the proper authorities with time to prevent the catastrophe. Dr. Webb had proven that civilian medical professionals could perform effectively even in extreme security situations. His ability to maintain Morrison's medical stability throughout the crisis had been essential to their success. Morrison looked at Sarah with deep gratitude. "You saved my life with techniques I've never seen before. Where did you learn that kind of emergency medicine?" Sarah smiled for the first time since the crisis began. 12 years with the CIA teaches you things they don't cover in nursing school. Sometimes unconventional situations require unconventional solutions. Federal tactical teams arrived at the hospital and secured the area, confirming that the immediate threat had been eliminated. Morrison was transferred to a secure medical facility where he could complete his recovery while providing additional intelligence to counter-terrorism operations. Burke shook Sarah's hand with obvious respect. "What you accomplished tonight goes beyond anything in the operational manuals. You combined medical expertise with tactical skills in ways that saved not just Morrison's life, but potentially thousands of innocent lives." Dr. Webb looked at Sarah with newfound admiration. "I've practiced medicine for 20 years, but I've never seen anything like what you did tonight. The way you integrated unconventional techniques with standard medical protocols created possibilities I never imagined."
Sarah reflected on the night's events as dawn broke over the hospital. Her transition from CIA operative to civilian nurse had seemed like the end of her covert career, but the crisis had demonstrated that her unique combination of skills could serve people in ways she had never anticipated. At 6:30 a.m., exactly when the terrorist attacks had been scheduled to begin, news reports confirmed that federal agencies had successfully intercepted the terrorist cells in all three target cities. The coordinated attacks had been prevented, and the larger conspiracy Morrison had described was being systematically dismantled. Morrison's intelligence had proven accurate and complete. The terrorist network's plan to trigger emergency government responses that would give them access to critical infrastructure had been exposed and defeated. The consequences of their failure to eliminate Morrison had created exactly the outcome they had tried so desperately to prevent. Sarah returned to her normal duties in the emergency department, but the experience had changed her perspective on the value of her unconventional background. She realized that her CIA training didn't have to be separate from her medical career. In the right circumstances, the combination could achieve extraordinary results. Dr. Webb requested that Sarah be assigned as the hospital's emergency response coordinator, recognizing that her unique skills could be valuable in various crisis situations. The hospital administration agreed, creating a new position that would utilize her medical expertise and tactical training. Burke visited the hospital several weeks later to check on Morrison's recovery and thank Sarah again for her actions. "The intelligence you helped transmit prevented what could have been the worst terrorist attack in American history. The ripple effects of what you accomplished that night will probably never be fully known, but I wanted you to know that your actions saved countless lives." Morrison made a full recovery and returned to active duty with enhanced security protocols. The surgical repairs Dr. Webb had performed under Sarah's guidance proved completely successful, and Morrison's testimony helped prosecute the surviving members of the terrorist network. Sarah's story became a classified legend within certain federal agencies, demonstrating how civilian professionals with unconventional backgrounds could make critical contributions to national security. Her techniques for combining field medicine with hospital resources were studied and incorporated into training programs for emergency responders. The night when Dr. Webb cried "It's too late" had indeed seemed hopeless by conventional standards. But Sarah's refusal to accept conventional limitations, combined with her willingness to apply CIA field medicine in a civilian hospital, had proven that sometimes the most desperate situations require the most unconventional solutions. Years later, Sarah would continue working at St. Mary's Hospital, using her unique skills to save lives and train other medical professionals in crisis response techniques. But she would always remember the night when her two worlds, covert operations and civilian medicine, came together to prevent a national catastrophe and save a federal agent's life when everyone else believed it was too late.